Hello, kia ora. Thank you for joining us. Welcome to this webinar, Seychelles Blue Finance, is it a blueprint for Pacific countries? Today's event is brought to you by Opes Oceani Foundation and Finology. My name is Glenn Inwood and I will be moderating today's presentation. I am one of the founders of Opes Oceani Foundation, which is a non-profit organisation with the objectives of advancing good ocean governance and sustainable development of the marine environment. Our presenter today is Dr. Alistair Hunt, a principal at the economic and financial consultancy Finology, based in the United States. Dr. Hunt authored the report, Seychelles Blue Finance, asking, is it a blueprint for similar countries? This will form the basis of today's webinar. We also have a few people today who are included as panelists, and we will hear from them later in the presentation. We have set aside approximately 60 minutes for today's event. So-called blue financing is likely to become more of a focus, especially as the Pacific rebuilds economies following the coronavirus pandemic and the adverse impact that border closures have wrought on island economies. Our goal is to grow your understanding of the Seychelles Blue Finance arrangements and how they were constructed. How do they work and what role is played by the World Bank, the Nature Conservancy, and other non-government organisations? How are these transactions linked to oceanic health? And will it provide an appropriate mechanism for Pacific countries looking to enter into similar arrangements? The Nature Conservancy says it expects to spend up to $1 billion on blue finance arrangements over the next 20 years. Before we start, just some housekeeping. If you wish to ask a question, you will see a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen where you can type in your questions you wish to ask. If you wish to speak, please send a question and I will give you the microphone. If there are any questions you want to ask after this webinar, please feel free to email both myself or Dr. Hunt. Finally, I will be recording this presentation and will make it available to download later. So without further delay, I would like to introduce Dr. Hunt, a principal of Finology, which assists governments, organisations and regions to reorganise industries and develop markets to grow economies. He has worked in the Pacific, Africa, the Middle East, Asia, Europe, and North America, and has experience in diverse and interesting arrangements such as Sharia-compliant financing, primary producer cooperatives, and public-private partnerships. Dr. Hunt has advised 9 Pacific Island nations regarding tuna fishing rights and was the Blue Bond external reviewer for the FFA's Pacific Islands Regional Oceanscape Program. Dr. Hunt's academic experience includes teaching in global MBA programs at the University of British Columbia, University of Arizona, University of Auckland, Boston University, Korea University, and the University of Washington. He has developed methodology for the World Bank in valuing government guarantees provided as sweeteners in international investment arrangements. Prior to his financial, economic, and academic experience, Dr. Hunt worked as an accountant, including for Price Waterhouse and ADRA, an international aid and development organisation. So it is my pleasure to hand over now to Dr. Hunt. Thank you.
Thank you, Glenn, and also thank you to Opes Oceani for supporting this research. Those of you, like me, who've taken an interest in development economics and the management of the world's oceans would have been fascinated to see some of these news articles from the BBC or The Economist. You may well have seen them, talking about the Seychelles Blue Finance transactions as a blueprint for other countries. Not surprising that you're on the call today, trying to understand what these transactions are and how they might be able to achieve something similar for your nation. What are they? How do they work? And how might I make them work for me? In fact, there's been quite a lot of conversation about in the media about a short list of targeted countries for similar transactions. And it's quite possible that your country or the country to whom you advise leadership is one of those countries on the short list. So it's worth this morning knowing as much as possible about these transactions. But perhaps before we look at the transactions, it's worth looking at the context of the Seychelles. How do the Seychelles compare with your Pacific Island country? It's a small island nation like many Pacific nations. It has low GDP and it has heavy reliance on fish exports. So in those respects, it's quite similar to Pacific nations. However, I'd like to just point out a couple of differences before we get started here. The first is that while it has quite low GDP, it has relatively high GDP per capita. Its GDP is just above that of the Solomon Islands, and yet the Solomon Islands has 2/3 of a million people, so its GDP per capita is relatively low. If you compare that with the Seychelles has less than 100,000. It's like Honiara's population. And so consequently, its nominal GDP is high at around $17,000. That's equivalent of many European countries like Poland, Hungary, Romania, and also similar to Palau, incidentally. So back in 2006, when Seychelles was actually tapping the debt markets, there were 154 other countries that had lower nominal GDP per capita than the Seychelles. The second way that the Seychelles is different from many Pacific Island nations is that it has incredibly small land area relative to its ocean size. So if you look at Fiji has roughly the same ocean under its control as the Seychelles, and yet Fiji is 40 times bigger in terms of land area. So Fiji has 70 times as much ocean as land, whereas Seychelles has 3,000 times as much ocean as land. So in sum, Seychelles is similar to Pacific Island countries, except that it has a relatively high GDP per capita and it has massive EEZ relative to land size. It's worth stepping back and just looking at how these transactions got started. In a lot of cases, the story begins well before the transaction, and this is one of those cases. So on the next slide there, you will notice that back in October 2006, Lehman Brothers organized a very large $200 million Euro bond, interest only, with bullet repayment, that is. And then the next year, they issued a 54.7 million euro private placement. And there's a $30 million supplement to the Euro bond. So this was an immense undertaking. At the time, it represented 29% of the GDP of the nation and 100% of the government's annual revenues. Not surprisingly, a couple of years later, the Seychelles was in default on both of these loans. And since then, the Seychelles financial story has been one of debt, default, and renegotiation. And that forms the background for the transactions we're about to discuss. And I think it's important to note that most, essentially, Pacific Island nations do not have this backdrop or history of default. So what are these blue finance transactions? Well, there's two of them. The Debt for Nature swap, which was implemented in 2016, and the Seychelles Blue Bond that came a couple of years later. The Debt for Nature swap was organised by the Nature Conservancy, and the Seychelles Blue Bond was organised by the World Bank. Both of these transactions were part of the Sweo-fish process that was established by the World Bank in association with the Republic of Seychelles. Sweo-fish 3 stands for the Third Southwest Indian Ocean Fisheries Governance and Shared Growth Project. Both of these transactions were prefigured and described in the original process framework of Sweo-fish 3. Let's hold off on some of the details of these because we'll get to them in a moment when we go into them in a little more detail. So why don't we have a look at the first one, the Debt for Nature swap. The first thing to notice in the top left-hand corner of this slide is that the Seychelles had just under $500 million of external public debt. The portion that was subject to the Debt for Nature swap was a $21.6 million loan to Paris Club members, which were Belgium, France, Italy, the United Kingdom, and South Africa, which incidentally is not a Paris Club member. This amount of $21.6 million was repurchased by the Republic of Seychelles at a discount of 93.5 cents on the dollar. So it was purchased for an amount of $20.2 million. Where did this $20.2 million come from? Well, you can see on the right-hand side, top right, that it came from two sources. The first was a loan through the investment arm of the Nature Conservancy, NatureVest. That loan was a $15.2 million loan for 10 years at 3%. An additional $5 million was provided by conservation foundations with an interest in international marine conservation. Those two amounts were actually either loaned or given to SECAT, which is a trust that is jointly governed by the Republic of Seychelles and the Nature Conservancy. SECAT passed on that money as a loan to the Republic of Seychelles, and the Republic of Seychelles then used those proceeds to repay the debt to the Paris Club members. You can also see that there's a second loan as the black horizontal line or arrow between the Republic of Seychelles and SECAT. This other loan for $6.4 million is for a 20-year period, and that will provide $432,000 per annum for the next 20 years. That's divided as follows. $281,000 of that flows through SECAT each year in the form of grants to various recipients in the Seychelles. The remaining $151,000 is retained in the Blue Endowment Fund to subsequently fund the work of SECAT after the 20-year period. The payments on the $15.2 million loan flow through SECAT and go directly back to back to cover the debt financing from NatureVest. Now notice something interesting here. The total indebtedness after the Debt for Nature swap is exactly the same as it was before. Originally, the Seychelles owed $21.6 million to the Paris Club members, And afterwards, they owed 15.2 plus 6.4, that's $21.6 million, but they owed it to CCAT. In that sense, it's not a debt for nature swap in that no debt was actually removed from the Republic of Seychelles. So it's worth asking ourselves whether this is in fact a swap. That is, if the Seychelles didn't reduce their debt, did they give up any nature? Well, it's pretty clear that quite a few things happened before this debt for nature swap. We can see that Aldabra and other areas of the Seychelles were designated as UNESCO World Heritage Sites back in 1982. We can see that the Seychelles had become a party to the Convention on Biological Diversity in the early 90s. The Aldabra was designated as a Ramsar site in 2010. And also in 2010, Seychelles agreed to the Aichi biodiversity targets with the goal of conserving 10% of marine areas. You can see in 2012 that Seychelles establishes a goal of expanding its marine protected areas to 30% of its exclusive economic zone. And by 2014, it had a system in place, or at least a schedule in place, to achieve this by 2020, that is by this year. You can also see what I noted before, that the Paris Club and the Seychelles had agreed to a deal to support ocean conservation. All of this had occurred prior to the debt for nature swap. So to recap, the so-called debt for nature swap didn't reduce debt, and it didn't involve additional environmental constraints beyond what the Seychelles had already signed up to. Now you notice a bit of a focus on Aldabra. We'll get to that a little bit later, I think, in our discussion, but Aldabra's focus comes into the spotlight quite a bit in this. Aldabra was a very important, or is a very important biologically and environmentally rich site. And the logic seems to follow along these lines. If a small marine protected area is good, then a massive one must be even better. Let's look at the second of these two blue finance transactions, the Seychelles Blue Bond. You can see that there are three purchases of the Seychelles Blue Bond. Calvert Impact Capital, which is one of the impact investing funds that's becoming increasingly prominent. Nuveen, which is an investment fund that is a wholly owned subsidiary of TIAA CREFS, which is the investment fund of the university and teachers unions, and Prudential Financial, which is a pretty traditional financial investment fund. Of the $15 million proceeds of the blue bond, we can see that 1/5 of it went to CCAT to fund the blue grants, and 4/5 of it, the $12 million, is administered by the Development Bank of Seychelles in the Blue Investment Fund. The difference is that the blue grants are made truly as something that is given to achieve a certain outcome, and the Blue Investment Fund makes loans that are repayable. The thing that I want to point out here is that typically a bond assumes some kind of financial rigor, some kind of evaluation of the underlying investment projects. In the case of Calvert, Nuveen, and Prudential, they did not have to worry about any of the underlying validity of the Seychelles Conservation and Climate Adaptation Trust or of the lending that would occur by the Development Bank of Seychelles and what the outcomes would be for the nation of Seychelles. And that's because they were covered, at least partially, by guarantees by the World Bank. Also, there was no real way that they could take over the project on default. There were no environmentally based covenants. There's no concern over the environmental consequences of the marine protected areas, the blue economy, or the resulting investments. That is, the investors don't have to worry at all about whether there are environmental outcomes that are desirable or not. Glenn has just overlaid the debt for nature swap on our slide here. And he's done that so that we can see the centrality of CCAT. You can see that both of the transactions combine together to fund the work of CCAT, both through a $3 million portion of the proceeds from the blue bond and also from $281,000 per annum of cash flow from the payments made on the debt by the Republic of Seychelles. Both of these transactions work together to facilitate the work of SWEOFISH 3. SWEOFISH 3, you can see on the next slide here, is actually a joint venture between the World Bank and the Republic of Seychelles. It is the Southwest Indian Ocean Fisheries Governance and Shared Growth project. It's the third one. And you can see that of the $15 million of proceeds from the blue bond, 100% of those proceeds go to funding the activities of SWEOFISH 3. You can see that 10% or $1.5 million goes to expanding marine protected areas. You can see that the other half of the $3 million that went into the Blue Grants Fund goes to strengthening fisheries governance. The $12 million of the blue bond proceeds that is administered by the Development Bank of Seychelles went to funding blue economy development objectives within SWEOFISH 3. What's interesting is you can see that there are two other right-hand panels in this diagram that show that the $15 million indebtedness of the Republic of Seychelles isn't the only debt that they undertook as part of SWEOFISH 3. They also borrowed an additional $5 million from the World Bank, IBRD, and another $5.3 million from the Global Environment Fund. On top of those two other borrowings, the World Bank provided a partial loan guarantee for $5 million to the purchases of the blue bond. And also the Global Environment Fund is providing this concessional loan to cover blue interest on the blue bond. So on top of the $5.3 million loan, they provided a $5 million concessional loan to cover interest. That concessional loan is made at 0.25% interest over a 40-year period, with the first 10 years being interest-free. And not surprisingly, that portion of the loan has already been fully drawn down. So when all the dust settles on SWIO Fish 3 and the World Bank's financing of it, the Republic of Seychelles will have additional indebtedness of $25.3 million. So stepping back, after both of these transactions have been and done, what is the result for the Republic of Seychelles? Well, first of all, they have increased debt. There's no reduction of debt in the debt for nature swap, with the capital discount going to CCAT. Secondly, there's increased debt of around $25 million as a result of the blue bond transaction and related transactions organised by the World Bank. In addition, the Republic of Seychelles received sweeteners in both transactions. In the case of the debt for nature swap, there's receipt of $5 million from foundations that will be administered by CCAT to the benefit of parties within the Seychelles. In the case of the blue bond, there's a $5.3 million concessional loan that covers the servicing on the blue bond, and there's also a $5 million loan guarantee. Perhaps most importantly, when evaluating this, there's also obligations under SWIO Fish 3, CCAT, and the marine spatial planning process. There's diminished sovereignty to the extent that CCAT is jointly governed by the Republic of Seychelles and by the Nature Conservancy. There's also no obvious cash flow streams arising from the activities within SWIO Fish 3 that would result in increased servicing of the sovereign debt obligations. So the outcomes thus far, both of the transactions have been funded. What we see now is that CCAT is up and running. They have actually had 3 rounds of blue grants completed. And you can see in the pie diagram to the right that 40% of their blue grant funding has been directed at marine spatial planning, the marine zoning process that underpins the details that determine the marine protected areas. The second round of Blue Investment Fund loan applications have been invited earlier this year by the Development Bank of Seychelles. It's a little harder to work out what is actually going on there, but if you have an interest in what has been done by CCAT and Development Bank of Seychelles with these proceeds, you can look in section 2 of the report and also the appendix, which has quite some details. So in short, the Republic of Seychelles has got $45 million of debt, and it makes sense if you are convinced that marine spatial planning and marine protected areas are a great idea. That's the main observable deliverable from these arrangements. So when we step back from this and you think you joined this call as a leader in the Pacific, and you, as a leader in the Pacific, you're interested in addressing marine management issues. You wish to see your Pacific Ocean environment unpolluted, vibrant, and sustainable. An important aspect of marine management is addressing overfishing. Now, the SWIO Fish 3 framework document identifies overfishing around the Mahi Plateau as a problem. In fact, it's the only specifically identified marine management problem that we can observe within the documents, and we reviewed literally hundreds of them in preparing this report. The proposed prohibition solution, which is what a marine protected area is, a no-take area, derives from a central planning model. Alternative to that is a property rights solution, which allows a wide variety of efficient transactions and accommodation between users of a marine resource. In short, saying that you're just simply not going to use a marine resource is not exactly the apex of sophistication when it comes to marine management. So let's compare and contrast the two approaches. The first issue that I think would be important to all leaders in the Pacific is maintaining and strengthening sovereignty. In the case of prohibition in the marine protected areas, it's pretty clear that SWIO Fish 3, which is a joint arrangement with the World Bank, and CCAT, which is a joint governance arrangement with the Nature Conservancy, really represent a central part of this approach, which is shared governance with intergovernmental and non-governmental agencies. By contrast, a property rights approach to marine management maintains the sovereignty of nations and their voluntary cooperation in regional groupings. The second thing to be careful about, of course, is public indebtedness. In the case of these marine protected areas, the costs associated with the marine spatial planning process and also the grants being made to support so-called blue finance initiatives are actually ultimately shouldered by the nation of Seychelles through the fact that they actually now owe debt. In the case of property rights solutions, they don't typically require borrowing. Aid, attractiveness of a nation to foundations, charitable foundations, is another important factor in comparing and contrasting these two approaches. There is a tremendous amount of interest and quite a lot of funding currently for these kind of activities for marine protected areas and other related activities, blue economy initiatives. And so there is an increased attractiveness to donors in this particular alternative. By contrast, a property rights or marine management approach does not rely on is not dependent on donors, and actually over time results in a reduced dependence on donors. Public revenue is very important, and you can see there that there may be some indirect national cash flow advantages associated with these blue economy grants, but there's no direct cash flow that comes from either of these two transactions or their related activities. By contrast, a well-managed, sustainable fishery will actually generate direct cash flows from allocating the right to fish in a sustainable manner. Fisheries management, well, this is the thing about this marine spatial planning process and the resulting marine protected areas. They simply say, don't fish in these zones. So there's no explicit management of fish stocks, either within the no-take zone or outside of the marine protected area. By contrast, a property rights approach to marine management is going to align the incentives and the objectives of all the parties around assessing and maintaining and managing the biomass of the fishery in a way that it means that maximizes the value to all parties. If just incidentally, just to give a comparison here, if the Seychelles had participated in some kind of property rights arrangement, something like the PNA's vessel day scheme, they could have expected over time, if they had brought the tuna fishery up to the same level of sustainability, that they would be receiving something in the vicinity of $40 million revenue a year based on the size of the total tuna fishery and their particular share of it. By contrast, they have something like $25 million additional debt, and that's a one-time thing, whereas that $40 million, if well managed, and that's of course a very big if, would be an annuity that would continue on each year. So with that comparison, I'll hand it back to Glenn, and we can throw it open to discussion.
Very much. Thanks, Alistair. I'd just like, before you do sign off there, there are some clear differences, I think, between the Seychelles situation and the Pacific Islands. As you said earlier in your presentation, there's GDP, land mass, there's previous marine commitments that they've made. And not only that, the Seychelles Blue Bond is a moving of debt literally between one creditor, in this case, the Paris Club members, to another, which is ultimately SACAT and the Nature Conservancy. So they didn't actually reduce debt, except just moved it from one creditor to the other. So looking at just an overview of it, what would your lessons and recommendations be to Pacific Island countries who are looking to explore a similar arrangement?
I don't want to dominate this because I know I've taken up more time than I should have. But I think if I was in a position where I had leadership responsibility in a Pacific Island nation, or I was advising leaders of Pacific Island nations, I think I would want independent advice going into one of these transactions. It all seems fantastic. We're all on the same team. We all want oceanic health. But I think it's important to get advice regarding the governance and financial arrangements around these transactions from independent sources. I think it's also important to think about exit because it's one thing to set up joint governance arrangements with a non-governmental agency. But, if one thing we've learned, Glenn, from Brexit is it's a whole lot easier to get into these things than it is to get out. And I think that really understanding both entry and exit from a governance point of view is pretty important. And I can mention a few other things that may be speckled into the discussion if you would like, Glenn, but maybe that's a few takeaways to just get us started.
I would like to see if Morris can join us. Morris is from the PNA countries, represents the parties to the Nauru Agreement. And one of the requirements of the Nature Conservancy's blue financing is that countries turn their 30% of their EEZ into marine protected areas in order to qualify. And Morris, I was just wondering if you could maybe talk to us, how does that fit with PNA countries who have built up the success of the vessel day scheme, and what impact would it have with that?
Thank you, Glenn. Sorry, my camera doesn't work for some reason in Zoom. It works in any other program but Zoom. So It's not that I've got it turned off, and it's not that it's dark. It's a very difficult question because, and I actually have more questions for Alistair than probably answers for you. The P&A is a group of 9 island nations, or 8 nations and 1 territory, and the fishery is managed in the sovereign waters. So they are able to make the hard decisions, whereas if you look at the Indian Ocean, it is mostly a high seas fishery. So I'm a bit unclear how you can establish property rights in the high seas, if assuming that's where the property rights are. Am I correct on that, Alistair, or are you suggesting that it's purely in zone?
Yes, that's correct. I'm talking here about the tuna fishery, which of course is going to be across a large area rather than just within their zone. So it is going to require some cooperation. Tom, why don't you jump in here, because I think you're going to have more expertise on that particular aspect.
Hello, everybody. All of the marine protected areas are within the economic zone of the Seychelles. So that's the first thing. And I guess the question is, what's the relationship between those large marine protected areas in the Seychelles EEZ, which Alistair already described as being very large, and the tuna fishery in the Indian Ocean, which does pass between EEZs and high seas, and much of it is on the high seas. So I think that is a lesser issue for the Pacific, where a greater part of the purse seine fishery, for instance, is inside the EEZs of the P&A countries, but it's still a significant spillover effect. And I think if you recall what was on the screen at the beginning of the slides when we were talking about these kind of initiatives, you notice that the photographs include photographs of beaches, coral reefs, and there's more land in those photographs than there is ocean, in fact. And I think there is a big difference between having marine protected areas in those inshore coral reef type environments and open ocean ones where the main species present are highly migratory. So I think it's faulty to extrapolate the impacts of marine protected areas in small inshore areas containing sedentary stocks of species to open ocean marine protected areas where that's not the case.
So if I can come back in, Ken.
Sure.
The experience, there are numerous proposed conservation areas throughout the islands, but I think it would be fair to say that a lot of them have not been properly structured. So they are established on the understanding that there will be revenue source or revenue streams coming from their establishment, and very rarely does that follow through. Just going back to the high seas issue, P&A has actually closed the high seas pockets for a slightly different reason. And that's really where I was coming from with my question, was what was the basis, legal basis, if it was a high seas closure? In our case, the closures of the high seas pockets to the purse seine fishery, we have no legal right to do it. In fact, we invited distant water fleets to go and fish there. But we did put a condition of a license in zone that you didn't fish there. And on the basis of that, no one fishes there. So we've achieved it, although it's not giving us any economic return in the senses that you're looking at, although it has displaced the effort into zone, which is a significant economic benefit. And hopefully there is a conservation benefit from having that closure, although that is debatable, considering the migratory nature of the species.
Yeah. I'm conscious that time is moving on, and I'm just wanting to bring in quickly James Movick here.
Well, I don't think there's one common solution for everybody. I think so every country will be looking at this in somewhat different ways depending on their national policies and objectives. But I would go back to what both Tom and Morris emphasized, Alistair rather, the importance of having independent, objective analysis of these various proposals that are coming in. I'm certainly up here in the north. I'm not seeing a clear pattern of blue finance investments that we can refer to as sort of a general trend. Maybe Morris has more information from the Marshall Islands, but here in the FSM, they're still going through the process of trying to identify this. And as I said, I don't see any clear trends or patterns in the blue investment activities undertaken in the South Pacific countries. But I'd be open to hearing more about this from Tom and Morris.
Okay. So, Alistair, is there anything you can sort of add to the information that you've provided today?
Well, James was just talking about, what's actually happening. And earlier this year, I had the privilege of reviewing the FFA's, the Blue Finance component of the FFA's project on sustainability and so on. And it was quite intriguing because just prior to that, we interacted on something with New Zealand's MFAT about them facilitating impact investing in the Pacific. So what we're observing is both initiatives from a donor country or investor country and a project country really focusing on trying to find projects. And this is the interesting thing, Glenn, that almost all of this activity, and there is a lot of it, from both bottom up with projects looking for funding and investors looking for projects, is that traditional corporate finance identifies an investment. They identify the investment, and then that investment goes looking for funding. What's characterizing this activity is funding is put in place, and then that funding goes looking for investments. And that happens at two levels. So you have banks going looking for countries that are willing to borrow to get into blue economy initiatives. And then once that country has borrowed, then they set up some sort of trust like CCAT or what have you, which then has to go looking for projects, because ultimately you've got to find somebody to do something with the money. So you can look through the appendix to the report and you can have a bit of an idea of where this money is going. But I would say, as somebody that's been advising in corporate finance roles in unique circumstances for a couple of decades now, is it typically doesn't go very well when you've got money looking for investments. It's a whole lot better if you've got an investment that's looking for funding, because then you're actually really using the structure and the rigor of corporate finance. And so what we're doing here is we're essentially using the nomenclature of corporate finance, which suggests a rigor. It suggests that these investors are actually going down and spending nights and days detailing through what's actually going on and what's going to be funded with their money. Nothing could be further from the truth. They're completely decoupled from the financial and environmental consequences of their investment. And I think that's an important thing to understand, because how it's being presented as recently as the last week in the Wall Street Journal and repeatedly in the Economist magazine is that the financial institutions are bringing rigor and discipline to environmental projects, and certainly from what I have seen so far, that is not the case.